Dr. Bobbi Herzberg, we're thrilled to have you with us again today. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Janine, and thank you to everyone for being here today. And especially thank you for letting me share some of my thoughts about Adam Smith and have a discussion with all of you. He's one of my, I'm sort of a fanboy of Adam Smith and have been for a long time. Obviously, economics, I think, is largely shaped by some of the ideas that he laid down and put forward as he was writing in the Scottish Enlightenment. And you see them present in all kinds of economic research and scholarship today. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that he laid out in very straightforward language that everyone could understand. And from the time that he wrote The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, so an important time, joined that debate that was going on at that moment in time. And it really just caught fire. But he's actually best known, or was known in his time, as a moral philosopher. And in fact, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he actually, his theory of moral sentiments, which is another very important piece, and I think critical to trying to understand his Wealth of Nations, this was already in its 6th edition at the time that he wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the Wealth of Nations. And so this is a 2-volume one, not small volumes either. And so this 2-volume Wealth of Nations is well worth reading, and I highly recommend it. But if you can't tackle all 2 volumes of it, if you read the first volume of The Wealth of Nations, you'll really get the core of what Adam Smith is talking about. And I hope and encourage everyone to go ahead and do that. And if you find it really interesting, there are so many sources out there to tap into. So as I said, he was a moral philosopher. Adam Smith was born in 1723. He was born in Scotland in a relatively small town. He lived with his widowed mother. And he went to the University of Glasgow and obtained an education with assistance, and then actually did work at Oxford as well. And so he did get an education, but he came up from relatively poor roots and was not a man of wealth, and was a very much his own self-made man. And in fact, his time at Oxford early on raised questions for him about the British university system. He was highly suspect of faculty members, especially in that system, in part because he thought the incentives were not right for them to do their work and to make sure that they were teaching students and not simply just being supported in their own work. And so I think we see back all the way to his time the same sorts of debates we have now. And he very much believed in people being able to help create their own education. He believed in educational choice way before it was cool, by suggesting that in fact lecturers and faculty had to depend on their students to receive pay. He understood incentives, and that's really what he starts to lay out in 1776. Now, along the way, he tutored a noble, a duke, and as a result of that, he was sort of set up for life. So then from that point, he could go on and do his great scholarship in moral philosophy and in economics, and really create modern economics for us. So in The Wealth of Nations, the thing he's most known for is this book. But what we often know from this book are just a few paragraphs about self-interest and incentives. And people often think of him as sort of the guy that talked about that this is why markets work, because we're all self-interested and we just need to look out for ourselves. That's not really consistent with Adam Smith's overall body of work. What he was interested in was suggesting that you could not depend on charity or benevolence of others, that you really needed to understand that people act out of their own self-interest and design systems or allow systems like markets to emerge that reflected those incentives, and that would produce better outcomes. So it's not out of the benevolence of the butcher and baker we get our dinner. It is rather out of their own self-interest, their desire to feed their family, their desire to do good work so that they are appreciated and can obtain even greater money for the products that they produce. He also pressed back. Another area that he's very well known for is division of labor, that he understood that if we divided labor and we specialized, that we were far more likely to develop real skills, and those skills would allow people to be much more productive in what they did. But in order to have division of labor, you need larger markets to do that. And so that is what this book about the Wealth of Nations was, an inquiry into why some nations are rich and other nations are poor. And in answering that question, he looks to the issue of trade. That if in fact we have trade, then people can improve their own skills, get much more productive, and as a result, they will become wealthier by trading with others for things they have become expert at. But that again requires trust. It requires the freedom to build those larger markets. And those were the kinds of things he was arguing against, a system of mercantilism that allowed government at the time to award the ability to trade to certain companies and not to others. So out of all of his work, we get this argument in favor of creating larger markets and greater freedom for people to improve themselves, improve their industries, and improve their families. And so that's some of the things that I really admire in his work, is his ability to lay that out for us and make us understand that it's you can be benevolent, but you cannot rely on benevolence alone. You have to have systems that allow people to improve themselves through their own work and creativity.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That was a great opening. Alrighty. So he was right around 1776. Would you say he influenced Alexander Hamilton?
I think that there is some influence going on. Now, again, things didn't travel quite as quickly as they do today, but he was part of an entire group of scholars, including good buddies and Hume and others, that were developing these ideas, and they were very much traveling through Europe, and especially his time in Europe as a tutor and traveling through, it allowed him to create connections with the other important scholars of the day. And these are the scholars that the founders would have been reading at the time. So while it would not be like get on the internet and see his book all of a sudden, it did get passed around, and the ideas got passed around at the speed of the time. And so when exactly the connections that the founders would have had, but we know from their own writings and their own references that they were referring to many of these ideas that were circulating throughout Europe and in Britain
Yeah, because
and
if you wrote it in
Scotland.
76, it probably took a little time to make.
Well,
But
in terms of this book, but his
yeah,
other work also
other works,
speaks
and
about
the way
some of
they were
those
all
things.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So if you were to kind of do an economy 101, I think you already did, but just to further this line of thinking, it
Sure.
is that you can't, that people don't become lawyers, or most people really, or bread makers or carpet designers or real estate agents. Yeah, they want to help other people, but they need to make money to feed themselves. You know, there's an element of needing to succeed, to buy, have a roof over your head and things of that nature. So when you talk about the benevolence, I guess it's that we all want to be benevolent, but we still, I guess in order to help others, we still have to help ourselves. I mean, it's interesting. You can't really be benevolent and charitable if you don't have anything. And I guess like that, to being on an airplane, and they say, put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on your child. And I always thought that was really interesting, because you think a mother would put it on their child first, but if you pass out, you can't get the mask on your child. That's, if you listen, that's always how they do it. So that's interesting to me, because you talked about the benevolent aspect. And I guess if you rely on the benevolence of others, which they very much did in that structure, it was the nobles that I guess gave him a job, and and I guess in today's equivalency, if we were to compare, it'd be the government, relying on the government. It's limited, and you need it at times, definitely needed at times, and a good thing to do, but you can't really rely on it, and then you can't thrive. And that thriving comes from competing with others, and seeing other people's businesses, and the trade and the things of that nature. That's the only way you can really grow. But you're a little stifled if you and it's a little bit dangerous to rely just on that, because laws and policies can change as well, I suppose.
I think that's exactly what he was concerned about. He was rather distrustful of the way in which government intervened in the economy, because it wasn't a large welfare state. We had nobles, as you say, providing, but people worked on the land in order to pay taxes, etc. So it wasn't a system just of that, but it was also government granting, in essence, to their buddies, trading companies, or to those in privileged positions, the ability to have exclusive or monopoly trade routes, or to be the only ones who could import certain goods, and so on. So it was the granting of privileges that he pushed back mostly against.
That's what I mentioned to you early on, and I'll toss this over to Chubba. That's what I was mentioning earlier. I saw a documentary about Adam Smith, and I've heard about him, of course, philosophy, and went and studied him a bit over the years. But he sat and watched in this documentary bread makers, and how there's just one bread maker. They can raise the price as high as they want, and they're the only one to go to in town. But if you had, he watched them with 2 or 3 or 4 bread makers in the street, and he watched how they would adjust their prices to get the customers. And so he was really interested in watching and then they would make different sorts of products, because different products would bring in other type of people. So I think that's what you're talking about when you have the competition actually helps the consumer, and the prices go down, as well as the creativity. The difference, I guess, the difference between a Samsung phone and an iPhone.
Well, and that was really his point, is that people, if they were allowed to freely trade, they would try to distinguish themselves from their competitors, either on price, by reducing the price and offering it to people who might not be able to buy it at all if it were not at a low enough price, even though the quality might not be as great. So we have that debate going on today. People will say, well, I do like to shop at Walmart, or I don't like to shop at Walmart. And they'll talk about well, the kinds of products or whatever. Well, obviously, it is that mix of the particular type of product, but also relative to the price. So you compete across several of this. So a great a craftsperson might, in fact, charge quite a higher price, but sell on the basis of the quality of their good, or the quality of the meat that they had, and their butchering techniques. And so those were the ways in which people could compete. And by opening it up, he believed we all are capable and have the knowledge personally to know how we trade those things off. But that seems to be the thing that's hardest for someone else to do for us. So for government to pick what is the right package of education, or what is the right package of healthcare, what is the right package of housing that is the right housing for you. Well, given that we have different views on how much we want this part of the product versus how much it costs, it's very hard for any other person to make those decisions for us socially. And so that's the sort of brilliance that Smith brought, is that this would work out in the market.
Yeah, and that goes back to people in Fort Worth, Texas might want something very different than someone in Rochester, New York, or that it's all. So if it's one size fits all, it's going to be different, including with healthcare. People want different kinds of healthcare. All right, Tova, here we go.
Great, thank you. I'm learning so much. So I want to know more about Smith as a person. So how did he become interested in philosophy and economy? And then how did he actually, kind of like what Janine was mentioning, how did he actually develop his theories? Where did this come from?
Well, again, I think he was a man who experienced, because he did go and he became an academic after his training. So early on in 1751, he goes and he becomes a faculty member in Scotland and teaches. And first, he was teaching, as I say, he was a chair of moral philosophy during this period of time. And that was the period where he, I think, developed a lot of these ideas. And it's also where he came up with how we interact with each other. And it is how we interact with each other that then leads him to try and take those ideas of social interaction that come from social settings and take them to this higher level of understanding what the consequences were for the economy as a whole and how we interacted. So think about when you enter into trade, we have to have trust of one another, that what we're buying is in fact what we've been told we're buying, and that we're paying the right price. And we do that with frequency. So if you're buying things that you buy every day, you're buying coffee or whatever, you develop your own taste for those, and you develop an understanding of what the value should be. But what about goods that we don't buy very often? Then we're often trusting in other people to try and help us. So his knowledge of how people interacted with one another really translates into his looking at how government had sort of removed the ability of certain people to enter into trade or to get products from places where maybe they could get better products at cheaper prices. So this whole notion of free trade and being able to buy from other countries at a better rate than perhaps you could buy if you had to buy locally. Now, Smith argued, we would prefer to buy things locally if we can. If you can buy as nice a thing in your own hometown, most of us are loyal to our local community. It's only when we really can't that these foreign or other broader markets become a real benefit to us. And so that his exploration of different ideas on the continent, seeing how different systems operated, he became far more attuned to institutional arrangements and to government relations and how that impacted restricted the ability of these markets. And I think that set him up then to take on this inquiry about how a nation can become richer and thus help all of its citizens, and not simply those who are privileged or at an advantage in the system. And so, that's how I think he came to it.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And then was there any controversy when it was published? And then why do you think it eventually caught on to become so influential as it is today?
Well, I think whenever you're making big statements, as The Wealth of Nations is, it's going to have some controversy around it. But it became, as we look back, it is clearly one of the primary texts that many have attributed modern economics sort of flowing from it. And part of that is he looks at the key things we're concerned with in modern economics: institutions, incentives, trade, division of labor and specialization, industrialization, the relationship between agriculture and trade and mercantilism. And he's really at the point where he's writing where we're just about to take off in that sort of industrial revolution, where we move from the agricultural areas and the farmlands into the cities and into manufacturing. And so how we do that becomes a great concern. So in the very beginning of this book, he talks about the pin factory. And so the fact that people were very concerned about how factories operated and the workers in factories and all of that, I think also meant that people were interested in what he had to say about that, because they were wondering, well, how will this be good for the worker and not just for those of privilege? And I think Adam Smith was one of those that really talked to a broader range of people, not simply to one class or another, and make it all about class and not about incentives and logic.
Thank you. And then could you talk a bit more about the kind of capitalism versus mercantilism debate? And then I'm curious, were there other systems around at the time, other major systems of economy that Smith was kind of challenging?
Sure. Well, I think he's challenging on all fronts, all different sorts of economic systems and how they could operate. His whole discussion about benevolence and social relations, I think, does speak to this notion of the feudal and nobility type of structure and its remnants that continued, that people would sort of take care of people that were poor at the time. And so he's really pushing back on that to suggest that the poor may have less resources, but a larger pie, a larger growing economy provides greater opportunities for everyone in that economy to do better. And it's only when we lock those in with these kinds of privileged logics and preference treatments that government grants to certain people but not to others, that you get into the problem of inequality being really locked in. It's not as if every peasant is going to rise to high standards under once this system is put in place, but it's quite a bit more likely, he saw, that even those that were least among us would have access to more of the necessities of life. And he also thought that while the wealthy and the privileged would have first choice on those necessities, that there was only so much money one could use and so many things. So they would get the better, but that everyone would get some. and that would be a move towards greater equality when he's talking about that. And so I think you see him trying to speak to so many of the different questions we're even talking about today. I don't know that he could have imagined the kind of billionaires that we have today. But even with the billionaires, it's very hard for them to live markedly different than they get up in the morning, they have breakfast, they have a refrigerator. I mean, yes, they may have lots of people to help them out, but there's only so much of that. And so he also spoke to that as well. And he believed that if people could rise and not be kept from rising, that people had this capacity. And because he came from poorer roots, in the sense of not being bestowed at the high levels of privilege from his birth, that he was capable of seeing the ability for self-advancement, and thought that those motivations would be far stronger in creating good institutions than anything we could design that would be hard to design in a way that was adaptable and flexible enough to accommodate the kind of market pressures that he saw.
Thank you so much. And then my final question, since we are constituting America, we like to talk about the Constitution. So what ways did Smith's work influence the US Constitution? And can we see any of that in the way our government or economy is structured today?
Well, I think we do. I mean, I think it's very compatible. The fact that they were writing at the same time, that the founders were writing the Constitution at the same time that Smith is writing this, what works in an economy. Smith is talking about economic and social relations, and obviously the founders were talking about how do we design this in terms of a constitution. But the logic of contending powers, the logic of distributing power as opposed to concentrating power, all of these kinds of ideas were very comparable in one arena versus the other. So whether it's the Senate versus the House versus the executive branch and the judiciary in the United States versus competing parts of industry and competing traders that are trying to sell their case, I think, again, you get similarities. Likewise, democratic relationships, which again, at the time of the founding, as you all know, these were very unique and new systems. We didn't have people running their own governments and governing themselves and self-governing in the way that the founders designed in advance of that, at least not on any large scale. And so all of this was relatively new, but it's based on those same kinds of logic of, you need to get me to think that this is a good idea, just as a seller of goods needs to convince consumers that it's a good thing that they buy their goods because they are better quality, or they are at a better price, or they hold up longer, or whatever it might be, or they're fancier, or they have luxury. So it could be it's a crappy product, but everybody wants it because it has that luxury stamp on it. So whatever people choose, whether it's for good reasons or bad reasons or foolish reasons or whatever, we don't make judgments in that market. We just provide, and when people's tastes or change, then people will move on. And those goods that sometimes are very popular at one point in time start to lose their sort of glitter or their shininess, and we move on to the next great thing. So he understood that, and I think the founders also understood that these would be sort of the tensions that we have in choosing politicians and in choosing policy, and they were cautious to say we need to have great agreement amongst us in order to move forward. So they built in a lot of contending ability to check each other, so that we did not have just one group's interest driving the entire thing, but that people retained their ability to choose for themselves. So I think there are great influences that you see in both, whether it was a direct or that each of them were being influenced by the discussions and the ideas and all of the sort of incredible things that were going on at the time. I don't know. It's hard for me to know.
Yeah. I never thought about it that way before. So thank you so much. And now I will pass it on to Julian Jordan.
Good
Hi,
afternoon.
Julian Jordan. Good afternoon.
So,
I take it brothers.
yes, we are.
Great.
Yeah, so we were a little late getting on because we were
Oh,
cleaning up our Christmas show, because we put on musicals. So we were here together
fantastic.
cleaning up, and we lost track of the time.
I confess I've done that before.
So how when we hear about companies like the East India Trading Company and we hear of business and mercantilism, can you tell me, just because we've already talked about it, but I don't really have a clear understanding of how did business operate then?
Okay, so in terms of those large companies especially, there would be a grant of privilege. In other words, you would give to the trading company the authority to be the one that was going to import goods back in and take goods from your country to another country. And so you set them up as a sort of monopoly provider. So it would be the equivalent if we set up, and you see this debate going on in terms of, internet providers, and then when we do cable companies and things, who's going to be the exclusive provider in that area? Well, that gives them a real advantage over everyone else, and it makes them less sensitive, perhaps, to price differences or to what the consumer really wants. And so they can charge more. They don't have to be as creative in terms of coming up with new ways of transporting the goods, or new ways or new goods altogether. If they decide that's not something they're going to import, that may not be available to the people at all. The price that is going to be paid is going to be set by them. And because they have these exclusive grants from government, there's no way for someone else to legally come in and do
Interesting.
that.
Yeah,
And so that's
think that
what really limits.
we hear about these companies and we kind of hear about that system, but I think it is apropos today to realize that we somewhat are regressing with large subsidies. It's more so something that was already tried before, and that the great creation of wealth that came with a free market was leaving that system. I didn't make that direct connection that was more so how business was before the opening of a freer market. What are the differences between like a Milton Friedman economics idea and an Adam Smith economics idea?
Well, they're actually pretty close, quite honestly. Adam Smith saw certain things that the public or government might be needed for, and so did Milton Friedman, but in both cases they were relatively limited. And so Milton Friedman, for example, he believed very much in free markets and in free trade, and did not want government putting their thumb on the scale in favor of one group over another or setting great restrictions. And likewise, that was what Adam Smith was arguing against as well. They both argued for sort of an educational choice logic, with Smith arguing that lecturers in Scotland should have to put their cup out and have the students drop money into the cup based on whether or not they thought it was a useful or worthwhile logic. Whereas in British universities of the time, people actually lectured based on endowments. So they were endowed to be the lecturer, but then there was no incentive relative to the students. And so many students didn't think they were getting the best education out of those settings. And Adam Smith was one of those. And so again, that is one of Milton Friedman's and Rose Friedman's most important issues, is educational choice. So we see a lot of similarities in how they come about it. And both of them also saw some place for even, some kind of voucher system, that we could put some kind of assistance in place. So neither of them, I think, believed in no assistance or no help. And some of that could be organized in government. But I think both of them would see government closer to the people being the more appropriate place to do that within communities, in part because there is that connection back to the assistance that is being given. That if you are providing for somebody, then and you see them, they're your neighbor, you care about them, but they also care about you. And so they don't want to take advantage of you. And so there is that accountability and responsibility and true benevolence that occurs out of those circumstances. So Adam Smith believed that we needed to have these social relationships to make all of this work, to make the trust actually play out.
And if we look at the role of self-interest, and I think that I guess there's a big divide between the idea of self-interest among a free market economist and a socialist or communist economist, because one sees it as a negative, and as more so a Western civilization, Christian worldview, self-interest is kind of a necessity. It's like a moral obligation to take care of yourself and your family. So I guess the question is, so if one person is saying that, well, there's going to be like a free market economist is saying everybody's going to end up acting in self-interest. So if you set up a system where it's all based on benevolence, then self-interest is going to corrupt the system. But if you set up a system where it's built on everyone operating in self-interest, but protecting the rights of each individual, then you're going to get the most moral system, or system that's good for everybody.
Yeah,
so then how do we communicate that with someone that then like is just not seeing self-interest in that way?
Well, I think that that's one of the most important, and why I try and emphasize the fact that Adam Smith was a moral philosopher before he was an economist. There really weren't economists before. There wasn't an economics department at the university. So he is very much grounded in what ways can we interact together that make us better. Now, when I say self-interest, and I think when Smith says self-interest, his notion of self-interest is broader than greed. It's not, I want more money because I want more. It's not that Wall Street, greed is good kind of a logic. It's rather, what do I value? So for most of us, I would argue, what we value is a good life, enough money to have a family and to be able to provide for our family and send kids to school or do the things we care about, maybe take a vacation or buy something we like. But it's also living in a community where people do care about them. We don't want to walk down the street and be tripping over people begging in the street because they are so impoverished. We want a good quality of life, and that might mean nice parks and good schools and all kinds of other things. So self-interest can be all of those things. Whatever I value is what I am working for. And so whether that's my church or my community or my family or just me, If it's just me, then that's, but those people don't have many friends, I don't think. People that are truly greedy all the time, they're not much fun to hang around with, right? So we like people that
I gotta
are,
pass it to I gotta pass it to Jordan real quick, but I also I would have put this in the question, but I just thought of it, was that the other thing is that if there is a bad person, they certainly are gonna have an easier time hurting other people in a system that's not free market system.
honestly, and one of the real struggles we have is, what if the worst get on top? This is one of the chapters from Hayek's Road to Serfdom, is why the worst get on top. And what he notes in that chapter is that, in fact, you're not afraid to lie and say anything you need to gain power, then you're more likely to gain power. Whereas the person that says, I can't really do that, or we don't know, or I want the economy to be better, but I don't know how to make the economy better, those people tend to not get elected or not get power as easily as someone who says, I'll say anything I need to. So his argument is that, in fact, the systems that are based on promises are frequently more flawed, in part because we want to believe that it'll be easy, that you can solve COVID by just a wave of government hands, as opposed to, no, obviously we've tried it with 2 different administrations. If anybody could wave hands and make it happen, I'm pretty sure a lot of people have been waving hands. So again, I think it's one of those where someone who will tell you, I can do that, even when they can't, or you can get this really good product and it's going to cost you nothing, and then you find out the wheels fall off as you're trying to drive your car home. That kind of person is not going to do well in the long run, but in the short run, they often do get away with those kinds of things. Yes. And so that was part of their worries.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I was always a really big proponent of a lower price point, get the most people in your door. Just all through life, that was kind of that's how I would do business if I was selling. But then there's the flip side, high price point, the person will be loyal, but will buy many less products, most likely, because it's a higher price. So now I would like to know, do you think that the companionship of those 2 ideals is the reason for the growth we've seen in the economy? And what would be the effect if let's say everyone chose the higher price point, better quality, thing lasts longer, the whole kit and caboodle? What do you think would be the effect?
Yeah, I think, and in fact, it's often we were protected by government to only have the one of the highest quality. Okay, so you're all too young, so I can say anything I want, really, because you're all too young. You won't be able to say you're wrong. But when I was younger, we were talking about glasses earlier, and having glasses and different types of glasses. When I was young, glasses were extraordinarily expensive. I mean, extraordinarily expensive. You could not go, first of all, they could not show price. They could not show any kind of information. So you went to the optometrist, and it was all regulated, highly regulated. And there were like 4 choices. There were not very many choices. And at the time, you might pay $200 for glasses. Now you have to understand, I'm old. So $200 back then was on maybe a family income of $13,000, $14,000 a year. So 200, whereas today you can go in 2 pairs for $70. And while those might not be the ones you would want to pick, you really can get 2 pairs of glasses for $79.95, which today would be the equivalent of getting them for like $10 back in the day when I was. Well, what's the difference? The difference is today, everybody can advertise not just on, we have the fancy designer frames with all the bells and whistles and different kinds of lenses, and you really want these, but they can also advertise on price. And so people who are price sensitive, who would not have had glasses back in the day because they could not afford those huge prices, now can go in and get a pair of glasses and be able to see. And those who want the cutting edge designer, everybody will know I'm really cool. I don't even know what those are now. So I'm not going to try and say a brand because everybody will go, God, she's so old. I can't believe she said that. Anyway, but you know which ones those might be. They can go in and buy those and get that benefit from it. And so that huge number of options that we have that we never ever had when in fact it was a closed or restricted market. That's what Adam Smith is talking about. And that's what, again, is it bad that some people can buy thousands of dollars for their glasses and throw them away and lose them, and other people have to scrape to get their $25 pair? Well, maybe, but the fact that some can and some get those mean we all get it. And that was really the Walmart vision too, is they set up Walmarts in places that didn't really have stores offering goods to poorer people. And all of a sudden, people coming through the door had the ability to buy a pair of jeans for their kids. Now, were those the jeans kids really wanted to wear at school? Maybe not, but a pair of jeans for a lot of people was a big improvement from going to the thrift store or not having new clothes at all, or having only hand-me-downs or whatever it might be. And so it's that recognition that you can do these things in ways that satisfy the different mixes that we have. Do I think it's great that, every rich guy seems to want to go to space now? I don't know. I mean, I figure it doesn't hurt me if they go, unless they land on me. If the rocket blows up and lands on my house, I don't have things to say. But I'll use the courts to deal with that. Otherwise, I think my life is improved by the things that they've produced or brought to us. I know as much as Bezos, and I don't always agree with Bezos on so many things, I am very happy to have Amazon. And similarly, Gates and my technology and all these social media and Zoom, whoever you are, Zoom creators. I mean, I'm just thrilled that we have folks that are hoping to make a lot of money and doing great things.
Okay,
we're benefiting from it.
I just want to jump in so we can talk to Kathy, because I know she has
great.
Okay, thanks.
I'm talking too long.
No, that's okay.
No, it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
I love all of it. I love all of it.
Quite a few audience questions here in the queue. Sandy Thatcher asks a really interesting question. In pre-capitalist times, greed was regarded as one of the 7 deadly sins. How did Smith and others manage to turn a sin into a virtue?
Good. Well, I think it goes back to what I was talking a bit about, is that self-interest is not greed, that they're not the same. You can be greedy, but we will treat you like greed. If you are that, Ebenezer Scrooge, we still have these tales, right? And we still think of people that are quite evil in many ways in the way in which they treat their money. And they'll have the reputational effects and all of that. Self-interest, by contrast, is that balancing between this is a benefit to me and my family, so it incentivizes me to continue to work for this. And by the only way I can sell you this product is if in fact you think this is a good product too. And so it encourages me to improve how I produce this product. So that's his whole discussion of division of labor, is about this logic of I'll get better at making the particular thing I do by recognizing that you're going to make my bread and you're going to make my meat and butcher my meat and bring that to me. And that allows me to make pins all day and still feed my family that night because I have money from the pins that are the best pins ever. And so you're willing to share that with me. And so that's really what he's talking about. And greed, we dislike greedy people still. The person that takes the last, the person that won't kick into the pool of money for the group gift. We still look disparagingly on those people today. And we did in Smith's time as well.
Well, and Gregory Thayer adds an interesting comment from Rutland, Vermont. He says, I believe greed is okay with humility. So there you go.
But
Exactly.
also, I don't understand how opening free
That's
markets.
it.
I don't understand how opening free markets so that everybody has more access and more ability to have things. That the glasses aren't just $200. The glasses can be $20 because you've opened up to more merchants and more opportunity, more free market. I don't understand how that's greed. But anyway, I'm going. Kathy, don't answer because I want Kathy to go to her question.
Well, and David Sawyer asked, and this is just a great wrap-up question, really. David says, you've mentioned Smith's support of open trade as opposed to monarch-orchestrated mercantilism. Given this, would you say he was a relatively early champion of a free market economy? And then, but David also asks, and it was asked earlier, if Alexander Hamilton, et cetera, were aware of Adam Smith and his writings. But David asks, how aware was Adam Smith of what was going on over across the ocean in the United States, behind the fight for, he said later, both ideological and literal development of a new and usually free society across the ocean, namely the United States?
Yeah, I do think that certainly Hamilton would have been aware of all of these ideas going around, but Hamilton also, he was more skeptical, I think, of the average person. He didn't think as much about that little issue of my preferences can be different than yours. And so he concentrated more power in the kinds of proposals he was bringing forward at the Constitutional Convention. And I think Smith would argue for the everyman more than that.
How aware was Smith of the United States developing, though?
I think they were very aware. And in fact, he writes about the colonies, he writes about slavery, he writes about some of these ideas in The Wealth of Nations. You see him laying it out, how these relationships were developing and what some of this was translating into. And in fact, I gave him some of the ideas for opening up that notion of trade and the degree to which movement back and forth was more viable. Because early on, probably there were limits on how many people could be trading all over the place. But as markets opened up, that became more of the debate that needed to take place. And I think that he was definitely aware. Now, it's not my expertise in that arena between the founders and Smith, but I would imagine that the ideas were percolating through the whole community, and Smith was very much aware of those.
And then here's just one more great wrap-up question. Mary asks, she says, hi, to me, hardly an economist, so much of Smith's ideas seem like simple common sense. I don't see the big ideas here. Your thoughts?
Yeah, honestly, they are common sense, and we see them as common sense now, but at the time he was writing them, they were quite a bit newer. And as a result, that's why I think it caught on and has continued to be read by so many people and understood. I wish more people actually read Adam Smith than actually have, but his ideas continue to live in part because they are sound and they are understandable and they are common sense. He, as Janine had noted earlier, he studied how people actually traded with one another and what mattered to people. when they did that, and how they formed relationships and trust and negotiating. And I think that is common sense in large part. But the person that writes it down often gets the credit for being the really smart person that observed and actually transmitted it to the rest of us.
But also back then, in the time of monarchy and feudal systems and things of that nature, people had no ability to get out of the situation they were in. And so I think in order to know that what he did was so monumental is to look at the time period where he lived, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, without question. Hundreds of years later, and the fact they still make sense. We still are talking about knowledge problems. We're still talking about trade. We're talking about free trade and whether it's okay to open it up or just grant certain groups the ability. We're still talking about all of these things. So the ideas
I really like the
are
analogy
here.
at Walmart too. I thought that was really cool, because in the olden days, just the nobles could get the things and the peasants had to just rely on the nobles paying them. They had no ability to go find their own job or go to Walmart and get a cheaper pair of jeans. I mean, it was very different. They didn't have any ability to go out and create their own businesses, at the time.
Yeah. Trade within the community. The community needs to get bigger. That's what makes, that's his answer to what is the nature and cause of wealthy nations.
Which is why he likes trade.
You get bigger markets.
Yes, go ahead, Kathy.
Well, I was just gonna say, I know if we're right at 3, and I know you have to, I know that a few people on here have a hard stop here at 3. So I didn't want to make us go on too much longer past 3 o'clock. But I did want to thank you, Dr. Herzberg, for being on so much. It was just fascinating. So we could probably take this another hour at least.
Well, I recommend go to the source. It's really good stuff. Go get, and it's readily available. Liberty Fund, $12. It's an inexpensive, I think. I don't know actually if that's the price. I shouldn't say, but it is very reasonably priced and well worth the read. So I highly recommend that.
Thank you. And
I'm happy to answer if anybody wants to reach out to me by email or whatever with other questions. I'm happy to please follow up.
Well, thank you. That's a very generous offer. Thank you so much. And we should also probably say happy birthday, Alexander Hamilton, today, because it is Hamilton's birthday. And next week, we're going to be talking about Alexander Hamilton's bank. So we're so excited about that. I'm going to invite everybody to come back and join us. And Janine, I'll turn it over to you for any closing comments.
Oh, I think we're good. Yeah, Kathy, thanks for closing us up today. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Herzberg. You were wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank
great
you.
analogy, great things to perceive. I'll let everybody say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Tova.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next week. Hamilton's Bank.
Hamilton's Bank. Great one. Looking forward to it. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.